We have truly been blessed, haven't we? Thank you so much. The woman that you see on the screen is named Penina Tombo. She lives in Kenya and is part of the Maasai tribe. And this week there was a feature article about her on the front page of the Los Angeles Times. Now you might wonder how a strangely dressed woman from halfway around the world would be on the front page of a Los Angeles newspaper, but she has created quite a stir. She has created such a stir that one person came to her home with a machete to try and kill her. She's created such a stir that several people put a black magic curse on her. She's created such a stir that a man came to their home and told her husband to beat her up and said if her husband was too soft-hearted to do it, he would do it for her. What is it that she has done to create such a stir? She has started an organization called Let's Save the Girls with the audacious idea that men and women are equal. She's focused on 3 specific things in their culture. She would like to bring an end to female circumcision. She would like to allow young women to go to school. And she would like to stop the practice of girls being married off at age 12 to men much older who already have several wives. One of her detractors said this: "My wife is like my child. She is not educated and she cannot do any business and she has no capital. She entirely depends on me as the only provider. She therefore has no choice but to live by my command and respect what I dictate to her." And he and other men do not want to see this changed. Well, before we laugh and say, my, how backward they are, we should remember that it hasn't been all that long that we have even given lip service to the idea that men and women are equal in this country. Do you realize that when my parents were born, women could not vote in America? It's been less than 100 years. I went back and looked at some of the political cartoons in the newspapers at the time that my parents were small children. The idea of women voting was controversial, and here were a couple of the cartoons. This one shows a woman standing up on a pinnacle like Jesus did during the temptation, the pinnacle of the temple, and it has the caption, "Temptation," and the devil is there tempting her with the kingdom that lies in front of her, and that kingdom is women voting. That will be the great temptation that will cause her fall if women are allowed to vote. The next picture shows a hubbub out in front of a polling place with a bunch of baby carriages and babies being held by people and passed off to people. And the idea is that this is the kind of chaos that would ensue at polling places if women were allowed to vote. Well, today we continue our series on Jesus and his relationship to various groups during his lifetime by looking at Jesus and women. But before we do, we probably ought to get some idea of how they viewed women at the time. What kind of conventions were there about men and women? Well, whether you were in the Jewish world or the Greco-Roman world, it was very clear that men were superior. Aristotle said, as between the sexes, the male is by nature superior and the female inferior, the male ruler and the female subject. There was a philosopher named Philo down in Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher who combined Judaism with Greek philosophy. He wrote a commentary on Genesis, and he said that it was Eve who sinned and then the man who felt ashamed, and from that he drew this conclusion: the woman, being imperfect and depraved by nature, made the beginning of sinning and prevaricating, but the man, as being the more excellent and perfect creature, was the first to set the example of blushing and being ashamed, and indeed of every good feeling and action. There was a Jewish work called the Mishnah. It wasn't written down till about the year 190, but it gave the oral tradition of the scribes and the Pharisees back for about 500 years. So you can never know whether any given rule was a rule at the time of Jesus, but you certainly know that the gist of them was the same. And in the Mishnah, we read, "The woman continues within the control of the father until she enters into the control of the husband at marriage." In other words, a woman is always to be under the control of a man. First her father, then her husband. The Mishnah also says that women are not to speak with a man outside of their house in any public place. In fact, it says that if a woman should speak to a man out in public, he has the right to divorce her, and not only to divorce her, but to send her away without the dowry that he was supposed to give to a woman when he gave her a certificate of divorce. In the Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer says, if a man gives his daughter a knowledge of the law, it is as though he taught her lechery. You see, there were male spaces and female spaces, male work and female work, understanding the law, learning about the law was male place. Women were not allowed to do that. So that's the background. How did Jesus, when he arrived in that kind of a world, treat women? Well, first of all, we have to say that Jesus doesn't talk a lot about women. He does say some things, some of them quite revolutionary, about lust and divorce and adultery that were certainly not typical of the day and had implications for women. For instance, they considered adultery always to be a sin against a man. Adultery was the violation of another man's property rights since he owned the woman. But Jesus says if a man divorces his wife and sends her away, he commits adultery against her. An unheard of idea that it would be against her that he committed adultery. But most of what we see is in the way Jesus interacts with women. And it certainly is revolutionary. We're going to look at 3 or 4 incidents today. They're familiar. We won't look at the stories in detail, but we just want to notice how Jesus goes against the convention of the day. First of all, John 4, the woman at the well. You remember Jesus and the disciples were going through Samaria. Jews usually didn't do that. They went all the way down to the Jericho Valley to avoid going through Samaria. But Jesus and his disciples went through Samaria. He sent his disciples into town to get some food. And while they were gone, he met a woman at the well in the middle of the day. And he initiated a conversation with her. He amazed her in at least 3 different ways. Number 1, men did not speak to women. 2, Jews did not speak to Gentiles. And 3, certainly a Jew would never drink out of an implement that a Samaritan had touched. And yet he initiates the conversation and asks her for a drink. And then he surprises her even further by saying, if you knew who I was, you would ask me, and I'd give you living or running water. And she says, sir, you don't even have a bucket. How are you going to get me water at all? But then you remember Jesus told her about herself, surprised her again. And he talked about who he was, and she came to believe. The conversation was interrupted in verse 27. Just then his disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman. This amazes them. This is not something that men did. But Jesus not only talks with her, but he sends her back to her village to tell everyone what has happened. And many believe from her testimony, and even more come and meet Jesus and believe in him. So Jesus not only talks to this woman, Jesus makes her the very first Christian missionary to non-Jews. Second incident, Luke chapter 10, Mary and Martha. You remember the story. Jesus went to their home. Martha was being the good hostess. She was getting things ready. There were men there as well. Jesus sat down and started talking to the men as a rabbi would. They sat at his feet and listened. He taught them the word, Luke says. And Mary sat down and listened at Jesus' feet. And Martha was miffed for more than one reason. Number one, meant she was out there working all by herself and she wanted some help. I've heard that before. And number two, this was not where she was supposed to be. This was a man's place. She's supposed to stay in the woman's place. And so she complains to Jesus, and she fully expects Jesus to say to Mary, Mary, get back where you belong and help your sister. And instead, Jesus says to Martha, oh, Martha, you worry about so many things, but only one thing is really important, and Mary has chosen the best part, and it is not going to be taken away from her. Another incident is also there in Bethany, a story that's told in all four of the Gospels, one of the few, a little different setting and details among them. But Jesus is at the home of a Pharisee, and the woman comes in deep appreciation with an expensive alabaster box of perfume and oil, and she breaks it and washes his feet and anoints his head. And this is absolutely scandalous for a woman to do this in public at this banquet. And she gets all kinds of criticism. As we look at the different Gospels, she's criticized because she's a sinner. She's criticized because this money could have been spent in a better way. She is criticized because this is a scandal that she shouldn't be doing. And Jesus says, leave her alone. What she has done is a beautiful thing. In fact, he says, people are going to tell this story wherever the gospel is preached in memory of her. And today we fulfill that prophecy again. But if you think that was scandalous, there was something even more scandalous. We think of Jesus only having male disciples, and he did have the 12 disciples who symbolized the 12 patriarchs, the 12 sons of Jacob. But Luke tells us that he also had, in addition to the 12, women disciples who followed him around and helped support him. Luke 8. The 12 were with him, and also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household. Susanna, and many others. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. So here you have some women who are high up on the socioeconomic ladder. One of them is the wife of the manager of Herod's household. And they are providing their means to support Jesus and the disciples, and they are also following them around. And not just right there, but they are in Galilee, and we find them again when we get to the crucifixion. They have followed him all the way to Jerusalem, and these and others as well are there at the cross. And when the disciples run, they stay at a distance and watch the crucifixion. And after Jesus is buried, on Sunday morning, these same women and others go to the tomb, and they learn that Jesus is no longer there, that the tomb is empty, and that Jesus is risen. And they go back to tell the apostles about this. Luke 24:10. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. So here the women are the first witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus, and the men don't believe. I wonder why Luke chooses to tell us all of this. You know, the gospel writers didn't tell us everything that Jesus did and said. John says if they did, the whole sky wouldn't contain it all. So they picked and chose, and they certainly chose things that would be of significance to their readers. I wonder if in Luke's day they didn't see more women participating in ministry. We know Paul had a number of women co-workers that he mentions. I wonder if there could have been some criticism of that, and if perhaps Luke includes these stories in order to show that Jesus had women disciples and had them ministering. When we look at Jesus' relationship to women in the Gospels, we do not find one single case where Jesus does anything to confirm or affirm the conventional rules of the day. Never once does Jesus say, "Get back in your place. Remember that you need to stay in your space." What we find over and over again is Jesus violating the conventions of the day. Jesus doing things that would be considered unheard of. And treating women equally with men. Jesus treats all of his children equally, male and female. All of his children are equally loved and equally valued, and all are equal in his sight. That does not mean the same. There are differences. We appreciate those differences between men and women, but all are equal to Jesus. But you know, the idea that men and women are equal is challenged today. As you know, I sat on the committee on the theology of ordination for a couple years, and we heard a lot of papers from all sides. And there were many who challenged the idea that men and women are equal. For instance, they looked at Galatians 3:28, where Paul says that in Jesus there is no Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female, and said this does not mean equality. One paper said this: Galatians 3:28 reveals not an appeal to gender equality, but to soteriological parity. What he means by that is that men and women are equally able to be saved, but that doesn't mean they're equal in this world. Another person, the context of the passage in Galatians 3 is redemption, justification in Christ, and baptism into Christ, not full gender equality. God instituted male headship at creation and reaffirmed it after the fall, and God ordained male headship at creation to be binding both within the family and the church. Although when you look at creation, it doesn't say anything about male headship. It does say that Eve was created as the helper, But that certainly doesn't imply subservience, because most of the time when that word is used, it is used for God as our helper. And that certainly doesn't mean God is subservient to us, does it? And Genesis does not say that Adam was given dominion over Eve. It says that they were given dominion over the rest of the earth. Jesus makes it clear that he considers men and women equal. And it seems to me that any time we challenge that idea and fail to see all of God's children as equal, we open the way to go down a slippery slope that leads to abuse and oppression. I go back to Penina Tombo. Her concern for young women grows out of her own biography. You see, at age 11, she underwent physical mutilation that almost killed her. She was not allowed to go to school. At age 12, her father arranged a marriage for her to a much older man who already had 3 wives. And she decided not to do it and to run away. And so she ran away and took refuge with Christian missionaries who gave her an education. She went back to her tribe when she was 22 and married a man that she's now been married to for 37 years, and who is sympathetic with her cause. Isn't it interesting that her concern for equality and her finding a new way came from Christian missionaries, people who had been educated by Jesus? I have a good friend who has a granddaughter who is 8 years old. She's a very bright little girl. He asked her what she wanted to do when she grows up. She said, "I think Jesus would like for me to be a minister, but I don't think they let women do that, so I guess I'll be a doctor." Well, it wasn't too many decades ago they didn't let women be doctors either. I long for a day when we will be so saturated in the revolutionary message of Jesus that all of our young girls will hear Jesus say to them, "Leave her alone. Mary has chosen the best part, and it is not going to be taken away from her." Lord, thank you for Jesus. Thank you for his revolutionary action to show us the equality of all of your children. And may we live it in Jesus' name, amen.